At 6:30 on a Thursday morning, I pulled my rented gray Nissan Altima onto Miller's Run Road, with a gas station coffee balanced between my knees and $73, left on the company card the Army still hadn't shut off after redeployment processing. The rain had stopped maybe 20 minutes earlier. Everything looked wet in that cold late October way upstate New York gets before winter officially shows up and starts ruining people's lives. The pine trees along the ridge dripped steadily onto the hood of the car. Fog sat low across the ditch lines. My shoulders hurt from 14 months of sleeping in military housing, designed by people who clearly hated the humans in spine. I rolled the window down halfway and breathed in that mix of wet dirt, cedar bark, and chimney smoke from somewhere farther down the valley. For the first time since leaving Camp Humphreys, I actually felt my nervous system unclench a little. But then I saw the orange stakes. At first my brain tried to make them normal: utility work, soil testing, county drainage project, something boring, something temporary. But there were too many of them. Bright orange markers cut across the property line every 15 feet, like somebody had started dividing the land into little slices. Fresh tire tracks chewed through the gravel driveway. My grandfather and I had spread ourselves back in 2011, using 2 rusted shovels and a rented John Deere tractor that stalled every 40 minutes. About 30 yards ahead, a yellow Caterpillar bulldozer sat idling beside the tree line with steam puffing from the exhaust pipe into the cold air. I stared at it for a solid 5 seconds before I noticed the sign: Coming Spring 2026, Blackthorn Ridge Estates, luxury mountain living starting in the mid-$900. The sign had one of those glossy renderings on it. Smiling fake families, oversized windows, white stone fireplaces nobody actually cleaned. A golden retriever strategically placed near a wine-drinking couple like the dog also had a trust fund. And right behind the sign, barely visible through the fog, sat my grandfather's cabin. My cabin now. At least I thought it still was. I parked near the ditch and stepped out slowly, still wearing my faded olive drab field jacket from the flight home. The cold air hit the sweat at the back of my neck immediately. Somewhere deeper in the property, I heard metal clanging and men yelling over diesel engines. Nobody noticed me yet. I stood there looking at that sign while my brain kept trying to force the scene into something logical. Maybe they bought land nearby. Maybe the county approved expansion on the neighboring lots. Maybe Preston had hired contractors to clear storm damage again and forgot to mention it. Then I saw the survey ribbon tied around my grandfather's porch railing. That little blue plastic strip changed everything, because nobody touched that cabin without permission. Not locals, not contractors, not even family unless Grandpa invited them up personally before he died. That place had rules, quiet ones. The kind families build over decades without writing them down. I started walking up the driveway, mud stuck to my boots. Gravel crunched under my heels. The bulldozer operator finally noticed me and killed the engine halfway through a turn. The sudden silence felt worse. A man in a neon rain jacket climbed down from the machine holding a clipboard. Mid-40s maybe. Thick beard. Yankees cap. Looked exhausted already, and it wasn't even 7 in the morning yet. "Mom, you can't be up here right now," he called out. I kept walking. I said, "This is an active development zone." Development zone. I actually laughed once under my breath when he said it. Not because it was funny. Because it was insane. "This property belongs to my family," I said. The guy gave me the same look TSA agents give people arguing about shampoo bottle sizes. "Then you need to talk to Blackthorn Development," he replied. "We got legal clearance 2 weeks ago." Legal clearance. I looked past him toward the cabin. The porch light was gone. The old green shutters had been removed from one side. Pink spray paint marked several trees near the ridge behind the house. They'd already started carving pieces off it. The contractor flipped through his clipboard again. "You Audrey Sterling?" That got my attention fast. "Yes." He nodded once like that, confirmed something unpleasant. "Then they told us you were overseas." My stomach tightened hard enough to make me lightheaded. Not angry yet, just cold. "You mind telling me who exactly said that?" The guy hesitated. Not because he was scared. Because regular working people know when rich families are about to become somebody else's problem. "I just work site prep," he muttered. "You'd need to call the office." I looked back at the sign again. Blackthorn Ridge Estates. My grandfather bought this land in 1992 for $87,000 after 32 years working maintenance at a paper mill outside Albany. He built the A-frame cabin himself with salvaged cedar and military surplus windows from an old government auction in Syracuse. Every Christmas growing up, while my mother obsessed over centerpiece arrangements and pretending our family belonged in country clubs we absolutely could not afford, Grandpa took me up here to split firewood and fix things with our hands. He used to tell me something every winter while sharpening his hunting knife at the kitchen counter. Land remembers who protects it. At 12 years old, I thought that sounded wise. At 31, standing in wet gravel while strangers prepared to bulldoze his porch into a luxury subdivision, it sounded like a threat. The contractor shifted awkwardly. "You okay, Mom?" I realized I'd been staring at the cabin without blinking. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I'm fantastic." Which was technically true, because panic wastes time, and the Army had spent the last decade teaching me exactly what to do when a situation stopped making sense. You slow down, you observe, and you never react before you understand the battlefield. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and took pictures of everything. The bulldozer, the survey stakes, the permit stickers attached to the temporary fencing near the road, every single logo printed on every truck parked near the property. Then as I zoomed in, on the permit number hanging beside the development sign, the contractor watched me carefully now. Not nervous anymore. Curious. Like he was starting to realize the woman standing in front of him wasn't a confused homeowner. She was somebody building a map in real time. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked at the cabin one more time. The upstairs bedroom window still had the crack in the corner from when Preston hit a baseball through it in 2004 and blamed me for 6 months. Some things survived longer than people deserved. Have you ever come home exhausted from fighting battles for everyone else, only to realize the people closest to you quietly started one against you while you were gone? Comment below. And if you believe family should never have more access to your future than you do, subscribe to the channel. I drove away before anybody could ask more questions. Not because I was intimidated. Because standing in wet gravel arguing with a subcontractor, making $32 an hour, wasn't going to tell me who put my name on legal paperwork. Route 9 was mostly empty that early in the morning, except for school buses and pickup trucks hauling trailers full of landscaping equipment. The sky stayed gray the entire drive south. My rental car smelled like stale fries and whatever chemical Hertz uses to convince people the vehicle is sanitized. About 20 minutes later, I pulled into Maggie's diner beside a rusted propane exchange cage and a faded Pepsi machine that probably hadn't worked since Obama's first term. The place looked exactly the same as it did when Grandpa used to bring me there after hunting season. Same crooked open sign. Same cracked vinyl booths. Same waitress named Denise who called every man over 50 hon and every woman under 40 sweetheart, regardless of emotional condition or tax bracket. She poured coffee into my mug without asking. "You look terrible," she said. "Military service," I replied. "Ah," she nodded. "That'll do it." I almost smiled at that. Almost. I slid into the corner booth near the window, opened my laptop, and plugged in the encrypted drive I carried for work. Habit. The Army trains logistics officers to document everything, because eventually somebody always lies about where the supplies went. Turns out, that principle applies to families too. I logged into the Washington County Public Records database using the diner's painfully slow Wi-Fi and started searching parcel records tied to the cabin address. Nothing looked wrong at first. Property, tax status, paid, transfer documents, recorded, commercial zoning request, pending review. Then I found the filing timestamp, September 12th, exactly 47 days earlier. A durable power of attorney had been submitted electronically through a private filing service out of Albany authorizing Vivian Sterling to act on my behalf regarding real estate transactions and related conveyances. I stared at the screen for a long moment without moving. The signature at the bottom was mine, not close to mine. Mine. Same angled loop on the A, same clipped tail on the Y, same pressure brake near the middle of Sterling, because I fractured 2 fingers during ROTC training at Fort Benning when I was 19. Whoever forged it had access to real documents. The coffee suddenly tasted burnt. I downloaded the PDF and kept digging. 7 days after the power of attorney filing, Blackthorn Development transferred exactly $1,247,880 into a Sterling Family Holdings account I'd never seen before. 3 days later, $842,000 moved into Preston Sterling Custom Homes LLC, the remaining money scattered everywhere. American Express Payments Luxury Auto Financing country club dues, a wire transfer for $18,417.22 to something called Briarwood Interior Concepts, which sounded like the kind of business that sold decorative bowls nobody was allowed to touch. I leaned back slowly in the booth. Not angry yet, that part still hadn't arrived. What I felt instead was the strange numbness that happens when reality becomes too organized to argue with. My mother didn't make a desperate mistake. She built a system. I opened Preston's company filings next. That explained almost everything. 3 active lawsuits, 2 subcontractor liens, 1 pending insurance investigation involving water damage at a luxury townhouse project outside Saratoga Springs. His company was bleeding cash so fast it looked like somebody dropped it off a cliff. Then I found the bankruptcy avoidance filing dated 11 days earlier. My mother sold my property to keep her favorite child from collapsing publicly. Classic Vivian Sterling. Nothing terrified her more than embarrassment. Not death, not betrayal. Embarrassment. When I was 13, she made me change clothes in the parking lot outside church because my sweater came from Target instead of Nordstrom. She said people could tell the difference. We were $30,000 in debt at the time, but sure, the sweater was the issue. Denise walked past with a plate of pancakes for another table and glanced at my screen. You solving crimes over there? Something like that? She lowered her voice slightly. You got that face your grandpa used to get before punching politicians on television. He punched one politician. Still counts. I rubbed my thumb against the coffee mug while reading through the sale documents again. The closing attorney's office was based in Albany. The notary verification came from a mobile service in Westchester County. There were witnesses listed I didn't recognize. Everything looked clean, professionally clean. That bothered me more than sloppy fraud would, because sloppy fraud means panic. Careful fraud means planning. I checked my deployment records next just to confirm the timeline. On an exact date the power of attorney had supposedly been signed in New York, I was standing inside a logistics briefing room at Camp Humphreys, reviewing supply chain shortages with 2 colonels and a civilian contractor who smelled permanently like menthol cigarettes. The Army tracked my ID badge entering that building at 10:47 a.m. local time. Meanwhile, according to New York legal records, I was apparently signing away property rights from 7,000 miles across the planet. Impressive multitasking. I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat. 3 unread messages from my mother. Hope your flight went smoothly. Proud of you for your service. Can't wait for Sunday dinner. I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim. Not one mention of the property. Not one warning. Not even a badly constructed lie yet. Just cheerful little suburban messages floating on top of a felony. That's the part people rarely understand about betrayal. The scariest versions don't arrive screaming. They arrive smiling while asking whether you'd prefer red wine or white with dinner. I reopened the county filings and downloaded every document connected to the transfer. Purchase agreement, title, warranty, easement disclosures, environmental review requests. All filed neatly into digital folders like somebody preparing evidence for their own trial without realizing it. The betrayal had paperwork, and paperwork leaves fingerprints. I closed the laptop slowly and looked out through the diner window toward the highway. Rainwater slid down the glass while commuters rushed to jobs they probably hated. Nobody in that diner knew my mother had sold my grandfather's land while I was deployed overseas. Nobody knew my brother's lifestyle was being held together with forged signatures and stolen property. And nobody knew something else yet, either. They thought they sold the whole thing. That was their first mistake. By Sunday evening, the rain had cleared, and the temperature dropped just enough for wealthy suburban people to start lighting decorative fireplaces they never actually needed. My mother's house sat at the end of a curved cul-de-sac in Clifton Park, behind perfectly trimmed hedges and 2 identical stone planters that probably cost more than my first used car. Nothing about the place looked accidental. Not the polished black Mercedes in the driveway, not the amber porch lights, not the expensive wreath hanging on the front door 3 days before Halloween because Vivian Sterling treated seasonal decorating like an Olympic event. I sat in my rental car for a full minute before getting out. Not preparing emotionally, observing. There's a difference. The dining room lights glowed through the front windows while shadows moved inside the house. I could already hear Preston laughing before I even reached the porch. Same loud fake confidence he'd had since high school. The front door opened before I knocked. My soldier girl, my mother said warmly. She wrapped both arms around me, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and enough perfume to stun small wildlife. Her smile looked practiced, not nervous, just overly polished, like she'd rehearsed normal behavior in the mirror. You look thin, she added. South Korea failed to include unlimited breadsticks. She laughed too hard at that. That told me more than words would. Inside, the house smelled like garlic, expensive candles, and furniture polish. Frank Sinatra played softly through hidden ceiling speakers because Vivian believed silence was something poor people accidentally experienced. Preston walked in from the kitchen holding a bottle of wine, with a grin stretched across his face. There she is, he said. Captain America. Wrong branch. You still outrank me financially. That almost made me laugh. Almost. He hugged me with one arm while keeping the wine bottle upright in the other, like protecting it mattered more. His watch alone probably cost $6,000. Last week, according to court records, his business account had been overdrawn by nearly 42 grand. Debt always dresses better than responsibility. Dinner started exactly 12 minutes later because my mother timed meals the way NASA coordinates launches. The dining table looked ridiculous. 3 different forks, crystal glasses, cloth napkins folded into little architectural projects. Meanwhile, when Grandpa was alive, Thanksgiving dinner usually involved paper towels and somebody yelling because the turkey fryer almost exploded again. Those were better years. Preston poured wine while my mother carried out roasted chicken with lemon slices arranged precisely. They looked measured with military equipment. I'm just so proud of you, she said as we sat down. 14 months overseas. I can't even imagine. I cut into the chicken slowly. You managed somehow. Well, mothers worry. No, they don't, I thought. Not all of them. Some mothers manage logistics. Some manage appearances. Vivian took a sip of wine before immediately steering the conversation toward safe territory. You should seen the fundraiser at Briarwood last month, she said. Complete disaster. They ran out of valet parking halfway through the evening. Preston snorted. One of the Teslas ended up parked on the grass. Mom almost called FEMA. Very funny. I listened quietly while they bounced through meaningless upper-middle-class conversations about golf memberships, kitchen renovations, and somebody named Cheryl, whose facelift apparently became too aggressive. Not once did either of them mention the cabin. That silence sat at the center of the table harder than the food did. My mother finally glanced toward me again. Oh, and don't plan on heading up to the property this week, she said casually while adjusting her napkin. The access road's under maintenance right now. There it was. Smooth, relaxed. Delivered between mashed potatoes and Chardonnay like she was mentioning road salt conditions. I took a bite of chicken before answering. Maintenance? She nodded lightly. County work. Drainage issues or something. Interesting choice of lie. Because the county permits I downloaded 2 days earlier specifically listed private commercial excavation. Preston jumped in quickly. Honestly, the place needed work anyway, he said. You know how long it sat empty. Empty. That word bothered me immediately. The cabin wasn't empty. I paid taxes on it. Maintained utilities remotely. Had security cameras installed after a break-in attempt back in 2021. But Preston always talked about ownership like proximity determined value. If he couldn't see something benefiting him personally, he assumed it was abandoned. You should sell it eventually, he continued. Market's insane right now up there. I looked directly at him for the first time all evening. How insane? He paused for maybe half a second. Tiny mistakes. Depends on acreage, he answered carefully. There it was again. Not emotional language. Real estate language. They'd both already mentally converted my grandfather's land into numbers. My mother smiled quickly and reached for the wine bottle. Audrey just got home, she said. Let's not bore her with property talk. Property talk. That phrase almost impressed me. She had reduced felony fraud into an awkward dinner topic. I leaned back, slightly in the chair, and watched them move through the evening together. That's when the disgust finally arrived. Not explosive disgust. Not rage. Something colder. Because I realized neither of them actually believed they'd done something unforgivable. They thought they'd made a difficult family decision. That was the horrifying part. My mother genuinely believed preserving Preston's lifestyle mattered more than my legal ownership. Preston genuinely believed he deserved saving because his failures came wrapped in luxury branding and expensive shoes. And both of them still expected me to play my assigned role afterward. Reliable daughter, disciplined soldier. Emotionally convenient adult child. Frank Sinatra kept playing softly overhead while my mother cleared plates with practiced elegance. At one point, Preston laughed at something on his phone while wearing a navy sweater I recognized immediately, because I bought it for him 3 Christmases ago after he claimed business was tight. Turns out business was always tight. That never stopped him from spending money like a divorced cardiologist. My mother returned with dessert and smiled brightly. Apple tart, she announced. Your favorite. I looked at the plate in front of me. Perfect crust. Fresh cinnamon. Vanilla ice cream melting slowly at the edges. She still remembered exactly how I liked dessert while simultaneously trying to erase my ownership from county records. Human beings are incredible at compartmentalizing evil when it benefits people they love, or people they depend on socially. I took one bite. Still excellent, that somehow made everything worse. Because, for a few seconds, sitting there under warm lighting while rain tapped softly against the windows, the whole thing almost looked like a normal family dinner. That's how some families survive for decades. Not through love, through performance. And performances only work as long as nobody walks backstage with the paperwork. I waited until after midnight to open the duffel bag. Not because I was emotional, because I wanted silence first. The motel off Route 9 charged $89 a night and smelled faintly like bleach, cigarette smoke, and old carpet shampoo. The ice machine outside my room screamed every 40 minutes like it was being tortured for information. Still better than staying with family. I sat at the small laminate table beside the window wearing gray sweatpants and an old army t-shirt while the motel air conditioner rattled unevenly against the wall. A local news station played quietly on mute in the background. Some meteorologist was warning everybody about early frost moving in by Tuesday morning. Good. Cold weather keeps rich developers uncomfortable. I leaned forward and unzipped the bottom compartment of my deployment bag carefully. Most people thought I carried sentimental things home from overseas. Photos, letters, maybe medals. Instead, wrapped beneath 2 folded uniforms and an emergency medical kit, sat a thick black fireproof document sleeve with reinforced corners and a steel zipper. My grandfather gave it to me 8 years earlier, right before pancreatic cancer reduced a 6'2" mill worker into a tired man who needed help standing from his own recliner. Your brother won't understand this stuff, he told me back then while handing me the sleeve across his kitchen table. And your mother only understands land when somebody wealthier wants it. At the time, I thought he was being cynical. Turns out he was preparing defensive positions. I opened the sleeves slowly and removed the original deed packet. The paper itself had yellowed around the edges over the years. Thick county record stock from 1992. Real signatures. Raised notary seal, hand-drawn topographic references from before everything became digital and soulless. I spread the pages across the hotel table carefully. Outside, headlights moved across wet pavement while somebody argued loudly near the vending machines. The world kept functioning normally while my family committed textbook fraud. Comforting somehow. I adjusted the lamp closer and started reviewing the survey maps again. That's when the geometry finally settled into place completely. Vivian sold the cabin address, not the perimeter. Most people outside real estate state law don't understand how strange land ownership can get in older rural properties. Grandpa absolutely did. The man spent 30 years dealing with county inspectors, utility crews, and timber disputes around Washington County. He trusted paperwork more than people. Smart man. The A-frame cabin itself technically sat on just under half an acre near the center clearing. But surrounding that structure were 15 separate acres of watershed protection zones, utility easements, gravel access paths, and timber buffer land purchased under a completely different holding structure years later. Mine. Not inherited jointly, not family-controlled. Mine personally. Grandpa transferred the perimeter title to me after Preston tried convincing him to lease logging rights to a guy outside Glens Falls who later got arrested for tax fraud and stealing construction equipment. That incident apparently clarified several things for Grandpa. I traced my fingers slowly along the map lines. The private access road feeding into the property crossed directly through acreage, legally owned under my separate title. So did the underground utility easements, and more importantly, the freshwater runoff protections connected to the cabin's septic approvals. Without easements, the cabin became legally inaccessible for development. No water access approvals, no rate expansion permits, No demolition clearance. Nothing. Blackthorn Development had spent $1.2 million purchasing what was essentially a decorative rectangle trapped inside my land. I jinced back slowly in the motel chair, not smiling, just recalculating. That's the thing about military logistics work. People imagine explosions and action movies. Most of it is actually patient systems management performed by exhausted adults staring at maps while caffeine destroys their internal organs. Wars are won through boring details first. Same principle applies to revenge. I pulled out my laptop and opened the county GIS overlay system beside the physical maps. The digital property boundaries lined up perfectly with the original deed packet. No ambiguity, no loopholes, no accidental overlap. My grandfather built a legal moat around that cabin years before anybody realized why it mattered. And Vivian never checked. Because people blinded by entitlement stop reading after they find the number they want. I actually laughed quietly at that point, not triumphantly. More like somebody finally understanding why the magician kept reaching into the same socket. My mother thought ownership meant appearances. The visible structure. The pretty part people photographed during Christmas. But Grandpa understood infrastructure, the ugly invisible things keeping land alive. Road access, water runoff, municipal compliance. He built protection into the property the same way old farmers build stone walls. Slowly, permanently. I flipped to another page in the deed packet and found Grandpa's handwritten notes in blue ink near the margin. Maintain perimeter control at all times. Simple sentence. No emotion, no explanation, just instructions. That hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly I could hear his voice saying it while standing beside me in that old cabin kitchen, wearing flannel and reading glasses repaired with electrical tape. Meanwhile, somewhere in Saratoga County, my mother probably believed the situation was finished. Preston probably thought his debts had disappeared. Blackthorn Development probably already scheduled demolition crews and investor presentations. All because nobody in that entire chain bothered reading the full survey structure carefully. Arrogance makes people lazy, especially wealthy people handling inherited things they never earned. I checked the timestamp on my laptop, 1:13 a.m. Then I opened another folder and started organizing everything into evidence categories. Fraudulent transfer documents, property overlays, easement restrictions, original title scans, tax payment records, deployment verification logs. By 2:04 a.m., I already had the framework for a legal injunction request. Not emotional revenge, structural pressure, the cleanest kind. The motel heater clicked loudly beside me while frost slowly formed outside along the parking lot railings. I looked once more at the old survey map spread across the table. 15 quiet acres surrounding one stolen cabin. My family thought they sold the heart of the property. They forgot hearts die pretty fast without arteries. And Blackthorn Development had just purchased an island without a bridge. By Tuesday morning, the frost had hardened into a thin white crust across the sidewalks outside Thorn Development's headquarters in downtown Albany. I arrived at 8:11 a.m. wearing my Army Class A uniform and carrying a black leather document case heavy enough to ruin somebody's week. The building itself looked exactly how rich developers want the world to see them. Glass walls, steel accents, artificial plants positioned with surgical precision. The lobby smelled like espresso and expensive liability insurance. A young receptionist glanced up from her computer as I walked in. "Good morning, Mom. Do you have an appointment?" No. That confused her immediately. People in uniforms make office employees nervous because they assume either patriotism or federal investigation is about to happen. Sometimes both. "I'm here for the Blackthorn Ridge permit meeting." She checked her screen quickly. "I'm sorry, that meeting is private." "I know." Then I kept walking. She stood halfway from her chair. "Mom." The elevator doors closed before she finished the sentence. Problem solved. On the ride up to the 6th floor, I checked the time again. 8:14. Perfect. My attorney filed the county injunction electronically at 7:42 that morning, after reviewing the easement documentation for less than 20 minutes. That's how strong the paperwork was. Lawyers charge by the hour. They move fast when the evidence already looks like a Netflix documentary. The conference room sat behind frosted glass walls near the end of the hallway. I could hear voices before I reached the door. Preston's voice carried the loudest. Always had. Certain men confuse volume with competence. I paused outside just long enough to straighten the gold captain's bars on my collar. Then I opened the door. The room went silent immediately. Vivian sat near the center of the polished mahogany table, wearing a cream blazer and pearl earrings like she was preparing for brunch at a country club, instead of participating in felony-adjacent real estate fraud. Preston sat beside her, flipping through development renderings. Across from them sat Marcus Thorne himself. Early 50s, silver watch, perfect haircut. The kind of face built by decades of charging consultation fees. Two attorneys occupied the far end of the table, surrounded by stacks of permit packets and zoning maps. Nobody spoke for about 3 seconds. Honestly, that part was satisfying. Preston recovered first. Audrey? He laughed awkwardly. What the hell is this? I closed the door quietly behind me. Good morning. Vivian's smile appeared instantly. Too instantly. Honey, we didn't know you were coming downtown today. Of course not. Because guilty people only prepare for conversations they control. Marcus Thorne narrowed his eyes slightly. Can we help you, Captain? Sterling. Recognition flashed across his face almost immediately. Developers memorize names attached to million-dollar transactions. I walked to the center of the table without hurrying and placed a stamped county document directly in front of him. The paper slid across the polished wood smoothly. Certified injunction order. Temporary development suspension. Washington County Supreme Court. One of the attorneys grabbed it first. His expression changed halfway through page 2. That's always a comforting sign. Marcus picked up the filing next, while Preston leaned sideways, trying to read upside down. Vivian stayed perfectly still. Dangerously still. What exactly is this? Marcus asked carefully. A notice that your demolition permits are now suspended pending fraud investigation and easement review. Preston laughed again. Too quickly. That's ridiculous. No, I replied calmly. Ridiculous is forging military deployment signatures while filing commercial land transfers through a shell holding account named after a family trust no one bothered researching properly. Silence again. The heavier kind this time. One of the attorneys adjusted his glasses and flipped through the injunction paperwork faster now. Marcus looked toward Vivian slowly. You told us ownership was clear. It is, she answered immediately. Then she looked at me with the exact same expression she used when I was a teenager, embarrassing her publicly by asking financial questions in front of guests. Controlled irritation disguised as maternal concern. Audrey, she said softly, this is not the place for emotional misunderstandings. Emotional misunderstandings. Interesting phrase for felony fraud involving 7 figures. I opened my document case and removed the original survey maps. Not copies. Originals. The yellowed 1992 deed packet landed beside the injunction paperwork with a thick, heavy sound that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. Old documents scare rich people, because old documents survive arguments. I spread the survey pages open across the table carefully. The cabin parcel you purchased, I explained, covers approximately 0.47 acres. Marcus frowned. That matches the transaction filing. Yes, I nodded. But the private access road crossing Miller's Run is owned separately through a protected perimeter title structure transferred to me personally in 2018. The attorney stopped turning pages. Good sign, I continued. The utility easement servicing the cabin also crossed my acreage. Same with municipal runoff compliance zones connected to septic approval and watershed access. Preston looked confused now. Actually confused. That part almost insulted me. He really had no idea what he'd sold. Marcus turned toward his legal team immediately. Tell me that's not accurate. Nobody answered him right away, which is lawyer language for terrible news. I slid another document across the table. Water rights, I said, filed separately through County Environmental Registry. You currently own a structure with no lawful access road, no utility corridor authority, and no independent watershed compliance. One attorney finally cleared his throat carefully. Mr. Thorne, if these documents authenticate, development access becomes legally impossible without negotiated easement cooperation. Impossible? Marcus repeated sharply. The attorney hesitated. Effectively, yes, that's when the math changed inside the room. You could actually feel it happen. $1.2 million transformed from investment into disaster in real time. Preston looked toward my mother like a child searching for instructions. Vivian kept her posture perfectly upright, but I noticed her right hand gripping the edge of the table hard enough for the knuckles to pale slightly. First crack in the performance. Marcus stared directly at her now. You sold me landlocked property? Vivian opened her mouth carefully. No, I answered for her. She sold you an island. Then I folded my hands calmly in front of me while the room finally began collapsing under the weight of paperwork nobody thought to read properly. Greed makes people rush, and rushed people skip the perimeter. Marcus Thorne stopped blinking for a second. Not metaphorically, actually stopped. His attorney kept flipping through the easement documents, while another one typed furiously into a laptop connected to the county registry database. The only sound in the room came from keyboard clicks and the faint humming of fluorescent lights overhead. Nobody looked comfortable anymore, especially Preston. He shifted in his chair and loosened his tie slightly, like oxygen had become a subscription service. "This is getting blown way out of proportion," he muttered. One of the attorneys looked up immediately. "No," he said flatly. "It really isn't." That sentence landed harder than yelling would. Marcus turned another page slowly, then another. Then he looked directly at the legal description attached to the environmental filings and finally understood what he'd purchased. A stranded structure. No lawful commercial ingress, no independent utility authorization, no protected drainage continuity. The kind of property issue developers fear more than lawsuits because it poisons financing too. Banks hate uncertainty, and this situation practically came gift-wrapped in litigation. Marcus set the paperwork down carefully, very carefully. That's how rich men handle rage when they've spent decades learning not to throw objects in front of attorneys. "You represented this parcel as fully transferable," he said quietly to Vivian. My mother straightened in her chair. "It was transferable." "No," one attorney interrupted immediately. "The structure was transferable. Functional access rights were not." Preston scoffed suddenly. "Oh, come on. Roads can be negotiated." The attorney actually looked offended by that. Not after fraudulent conveyance allegations and emergency injunction filings. That shut him up fast. I remained standing near the end of the table without speaking. No reason to interrupt momentum when people are destroying themselves professionally. Marcus rubbed both hands slowly across his face. "How exposed am I here?" Attorney number 1 answered first. "If the power of attorney signature proves fraudulent, every transaction downstream becomes compromised." Attorney number 2 jumped in immediately afterward. "Potentially including wire fraud exposure due to interstate fund transfers connected to knowingly invalid title representations." The room went completely still. There it was. Not family drama anymore. "Federal language," Preston laughed nervously. "Federal? Seriously? Nobody committed fraud." I finally looked at him again. "The notary filing says I signed legal transfer documents in New York on September 12th at 11:20 a.m. So? I was inside a secured military briefing room in South Korea at 12:20 a.m. Eastern Standard Time that same day." Silence. Then I added calmly, "The Army tracks badge entries." That one hit. You could physically watch Preston's confidence fold inward, not because he suddenly developed morality, because people like Preston survive by assuming consequences stay theoretical forever. Then paperwork shows up. Marcus turned toward Vivian slowly. "You told me your daughter approved this sale." "She would have eventually," Vivian snapped before catching herself. That answer stunned even me a little. Not because it was cruel, because she genuinely believed it justified the theft. The room noticed too. One attorney removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair like he wanted emotional distance from the conversation for future courtroom testimony. Marcus stared at Vivian for several long seconds. "I paid $1.2 million for development-ready land." "You still own the cabin," Vivian insisted weakly. "The cabin?" Marcus barked suddenly. "What exactly do you think a commercial subdivision requires?" Nobody answered. He stood abruptly from the table and grabbed the survey maps again. "You sold me a luxury project with no guaranteed access roads, no utility continuity, active title disputes, environmental restriction exposure, and fraudulent authorization paperwork." Each phrase got louder, not theatrical loud. Controlled executive fury, the expensive kind. Preston tried stepping in again. "Look, we can work something out." Marcus turned on him instantly. "With what money?" That one landed clean. Because everybody in the room suddenly understood something else too. Blackthorn Development wasn't the only company bleeding financially. Preston's entire fake success story sat on life support powered by stolen property. Marcus looked toward the attorneys again. "How quickly can we freeze remaining transfers?" "Immediately," one answered. "And civil litigation?" "Today." Vivian finally lost control of her expression then, not dramatically. Just a tiny crack around the eyes. the first visible sign that her social instincts were failing under pressure. "This is absurd," she whispered. "We are not criminals." Attorney number 2 gave a tiny shrug. "That will ultimately be determined elsewhere." That sentence practically smelled like billing hours. I adjusted the gold captain's bars on my collar quietly, while the room spiraled deeper into collapse. Funny thing about military uniforms. People assume they create intimidation. Sometimes they just create contrast. Because while everyone else in that room looked sweaty and desperate and morally flexible, I looked exactly like what I was. Prepared. Marcus paced once toward the glass wall overlooking downtown Albany before turning back around sharply. "You forged military deployment signatures?" he demanded. Vivian looked toward me instead of him. That part mattered. Even now, she still viewed me as the real audience, the person she needed emotional leverage over. "Audrey," she said softly, "you know your brother was under enormous pressure." There it was again, not denial, justification. Like financial panic transformed theft into family teamwork. I kept my voice even. "You sold inherited property I legally owned. We were trying to save the family." "No," I replied. "You were trying to save appearances." That one hurt her, not visibly at first. Vivian spent decades mastering facial control the way politicians learn handshakes. But I saw the reaction anyway. Tiny inhale, jaw tightening slightly. Because deep down, she knew it was true. Everything in her life revolved around maintaining the illusion that the Sterlings belonged among wealthy people, instead of orbiting debt while pretending not to sweat. Country club memberships, luxury renovations, imported wine, designer kitchens, all funded through pressure, borrowing, manipulation, or eventually theft. And now the illusion was dying under fluorescent lighting in front of corporate attorneys, billing $400 an hour. Marcus slammed the survey packet back onto the table. "You people misrepresented a major commercial acquisition. No response. You exposed my company to litigation. Still nothing." Then he looked directly at me. "What do you want?" Simple question. Everyone in the room turned toward me finally. Not the angry daughter. Not the emotional victim, the owner. I folded the injunction paperwork neatly back into my document case before answering. "For now," I said calmly, "I want demolition crews off my land," and for the first time, since I walked into that room, nobody argued with me. Because the truth had finally finished speaking, and it never needed to raise its voice. Marcus Thorne left the conference room so fast, the glass door slammed hard enough to rattle the walls. Both attorneys followed immediately behind him, carrying binders, laptops, and the exhausted facial expressions of men already calculating billable catastrophe hours. One of them paused briefly near the doorway. "Mrs. Sterling," he said carefully, "I strongly advise you not to contact additional financial institutions until counsel is retained." That was lawyer language for stop digging before federal agencies notice the shovel. Then they were gone. The room fell silent, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and Preston breathing too fast beside the conference table. Nobody looked wealthy anymore. That illusion disappeared first. Preston loosened his tie completely now, his face pale and damp around the forehead. My mother still sat upright, but the performance had finally started slipping in visible ways. Her lipstick looked uneven. Her mascara had begun collecting near the corners of her eyes. And for the first time in my entire life, Vivian Sterling looked old. Not elderly, just tired in a real way money couldn't soften. Preston stood abruptly. "This is insane," he snapped. "You can't actually let this happen." I looked at him calmly. "You already let it happen. That's not what I mean, and you know it." He pointed toward the documents scattered across the table. "You're really going to destroy everything over paperwork?" Paperwork. Interesting word choice from a man whose entire lifestyle depended on loan agreements, title filings, investor contracts, and unpaid invoices hidden behind luxury branding. I answered evenly. "You forged ownership transfers while I was deployed overseas. We were trying to fix things." "No," I said. "You were trying to avoid consequences." That hit harder than yelling would have. Because Preston knew it was true. His company was already collapsing before they touched my property. He'd spent years building a fake version of success for social media, clients, and country club conversations. Leased vehicles, borrowed watches, contractors waiting 90 days for payment while he posted vacation photos from Scottsdale pretending business was booming. The cabin sale wasn't a desperate final option. It was the next dishonest shortcut in a long line of dishonest shortcuts. My mother suddenly stood and moved around the table quickly. Too quickly. One second, she was frozen beside the leather conference chair. The next, both hands were gripping the sleeve of my uniform jacket, tightly enough to wrinkle the fabric. "Audrey," she whispered, and there it was, the voice. Not her real voice, the emergency version, the one designed to trigger guilt before logic could respond. I'd heard it my whole life. After Preston crashed Dad's SUV at 17. After she secretly used my college savings to cover tax debt. After she convinced Grandpa to refinance part of his pension investments because family helps family. Every disaster somehow arrived wrapped in emotional obligation. Her fingers tightened around my sleeve. "You cannot do this to your brother." I looked down at her hands carefully. Perfect manicure, diamond bracelet. Wedding ring she still wore 5 years after my father divorced her, because apparently denial coordinated better with pearl earrings. "He could go bankrupt," she continued shakily. "There could be criminal charges if this escalates." Criminal charges. Amazing how quickly she finally found accurate vocabulary once wealthy people started threatening her personally. Preston stepped closer too now. "Audrey, come on," he said quietly. "We can fix this." Fix. Another interesting word. Families like mine never used the words lie, steal, manipulate, or betray. Everything became softer language. Fix, miscommunication, pressure, mistake. Like morality was just bad public relations. My mother's eyes filled with tears suddenly. Real tears, too. That's the complicated part. Manipulative people still cry honestly sometimes. She looked up at me desperately. "You're his sister. No apology. Notice that. Not, 'I'm sorry I stole from you.' Not, 'I endangered your home.' Not, 'I forged legal documents during your deployment.' Just obligation. Blood relation presented like debt collection. A good sister would not let this destroy her family," she whispered. I felt something then, but not anger. Honestly, the anger had already burned out somewhere around the third fraudulent filing review in that motel room. What I felt now was exhaustion, the deep kind. The kind military people carry after realizing they spent years protecting people who would absolutely leave them behind emotionally if maintaining appearances required it. I looked at my mother carefully while she clung to my uniform sleeve, and suddenly I saw the whole machine clearly. Vivian Sterling didn't love people. She managed them. Prestige from one child, financial rescue from another, public sympathy from church friends, validation from country club women pretending everybody's marriage was happier than it actually was. Everything transactional. Everything arranged to maintain the image. And she honestly believed sacrificing me quietly was acceptable because I was the reliable one. Reliable children become emotional infrastructure in dysfunctional families. Nobody notices the bridge until they start setting it on fire. "You need to sign the easements over," she pleaded softly now. "Please. We'll work everything else out later." There it was, the actual request. Not accountability, not reconciliation. Compliance. She still believed this conversation ended with me rescuing them from consequences. I glanced toward Preston. He couldn't even meet my eyes anymore. That part hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed loyalty from him. Because somewhere underneath all the fraud and arrogance, I suddenly saw a frightened little boy who spent his whole life learning our mother would rather manipulate reality than allow him to fail honestly. She broke him too, just differently. My mother's grip tightened again. "Audrey." I gently removed her hands from my sleeve, very calmly, very carefully. No dramatic movement, no cruelty, just finality. Then I looked directly at the woman who sold my grandfather's land to finance a lifestyle none of us could actually afford. And for the first time in that room, I spoke softly. "I cannot afford your kind of love." That sentence landed harder than anything else I'd said all morning, because deep down, she understood exactly what it meant. Her version of love always came attached to invoices, emotional invoices, financial invoices, sacrificial invoices, and eventually somebody in the family always paid them. Usually me. Not anymore. My mother stared at me like she no longer recognized the person standing there. Maybe she didn't, because the version of me she understood was the one willing to carry everyone else's weight quietly while they called it loyalty. But something changes in people once they realize survival and self-respect are not the same thing. I picked up my document case from the table and smoothed the front of my uniform jacket, where her hands had wrinkled the fabric. Then I walked toward the conference room door, while both of them stood frozen behind me, inside the ruins of everything they spent years pretending was stable. Some families collapse loudly. Mine collapsed politely, which somehow felt worse. I stepped out of Thorn Development's building just after noon into cold October air that smelled like rain and wet concrete. Downtown Albany moved around me normally. Traffic lights changed. People carried coffee cups across intersections. A guy in a navy pea coat argued into a Bluetooth headset outside the parking garage, while somebody nearby dragged a suitcase through puddles left behind from the morning storm. Nobody on that sidewalk knew my family had just detonated itself 6 floors above their heads. Funny how personal disasters never interrupt public schedules. I stood there for a minute with my document case tucked beneath my arm while cold. Wind pushed against the front of my uniform jacket, and for the first time in weeks, my body stopped bracing for impact. Not relief exactly. More like silence after machinery powers down. My phone vibrated almost immediately. 3 missed calls from Preston. 2 from my mother. 1 voicemail already waiting. I deleted the voicemail without listening to it. That probably sounds harsh to people lucky enough to come from functional families. But once you spend enough years inside emotional manipulation, you learn something important. Explanations are often just negotiations wearing softer clothes. I walked toward the parking garage slowly, while leaves scraped across the sidewalk near my shoes. Halfway there, my phone buzzed again with a text from Preston. Please don't do this. Interesting message. Because this wasn't a thing I created. This already existed the second they filed forged documents and wired stolen money through shell accounts. Consequences just finally caught up with it. I locked my phone and kept walking. By the end of that week, Blackthorn Development formally suspended the project pending full title review and fraud investigation. My attorney filed extended claims against the transfer process, while county officials froze additional permit actions connected to the property. Apparently, Washington County takes forged military deployment signatures personally. Good to know. Preston's construction company lost 2 pending contracts within 11 days after rumors started moving through lenders and suppliers. Turns out investors become nervous when federal fraud language enters conversations unexpectedly. One subcontractor sued him for unpaid invoices totaling $94,217.63. Another placed liens against equipment storage yards outside Saratoga Springs. The collapse moved fast after that. Debt usually does. My mother tried contacting me repeatedly during those first 2 weeks. Long emotional emails, Bible verses, messages about forgiveness. One handwritten letter claiming stress and pressure had caused temporary lapses in judgment. Not once did she fully admit what they actually did. That part mattered more than she understood. Real accountability uses complete sentences. Eventually, the calls stopped. Silence settled in naturally after that. Not dramatic silence, just distance. The adult kind. 3 weeks later, I drove back up Miller's Run Road just after sunrise carrying groceries, fresh batteries for the smoke detectors, and a replacement porch light I bought at a hardware store outside Glens Falls. The development sign was gone, so were the bulldozers. Only tire marks remained near the edge of the gravel road where contractors had started preparing the site before the injunction shut everything down cold. The trees looked untouched again, patient, like they'd seen human stupidity come and go before. I parked near the cabin and stepped out into sharp morning air, cold enough to sting my lungs slightly. Frost covered parts of the grass near the tree line. Somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard branches shifting softly in the wind. No engines, no construction noise. Just quiet. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. That happens sometimes after military deployment. Your brain spends over a year inside concrete compounds and crowded bases. Then suddenly ordinary things feel almost delicate when you return to them. I climbed the porch steps slowly. The cracked upstairs window Preston broke 20 years earlier still caught morning light the same way it always had. The cedar siding needed fresh stain before winter. One of the gutters sagged slightly near the north corner. Normal problems. Honest ones. I unlocked the front door and walked inside. Cold air greeted me immediately, along with the smell of old pine wood dust and stone fireplace ash. The place still felt like Grandpa, somehow. Not haunted exactly. Just present in small practical details. Extra flashlight batteries stored beside the sink, labels on fuse box switches written in thick black marker, coffee cans filled with screws sorted by size. I set the grocery bags down and opened the kitchen window slightly to let fresh air move through the rooms. Then I stepped back outside onto the porch with a cup of coffee and sat down in Grandpa's old wooden chair facing the tree line. The 15 acres stretched quietly around the cabin in every direction. Ancient pine trees, runoff creeks. The gravel access road curling down toward Miller's Run. Invisible legal boundaries hidden beneath dirt, roots, and frost-covered grass. The perimeter. That word meant something different to me now. Growing up, I thought dignity came from achievement, military rank, discipline, endurance, being useful enough for people to value you. But sitting there alone with cold air moving through the trees, I finally understood something my grandfather tried teaching me years ago without ever saying directly. Dignity is infrastructure. You build it carefully, you maintain it quietly, and you defend it before desperate people convince you sacrificing yourself is the same thing as love. The wind moved gently through the pines while sunlight slowly broke across the ridge beyond the property. For the first time in my life, nobody was asking me to carry them. Nobody was demanding access to pieces of me they didn't earn. Nobody was standing nearby waiting for me to fix consequences they created themselves. Just land, silence, and enough distance to finally hear my own thoughts clearly. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked out across the property my grandfather trusted me to protect. Then I breathed in the cold morning air and understood exactly why he left the perimeter to me instead of the cabin itself. Structures are easy to steal. Foundations are harder. And somewhere beyond the trees, past the county roads and collapsing lies and unfinished lawsuits, my family was still spinning in circles, trying to outrun consequences. But I wasn't spinning anymore. I knew where north was. A few people asked me afterward whether I regretted fighting my own family over the property. The honest answer? I regretted waiting so long to understand the role I was playing in that family to begin with. Because once the lawyers stopped calling and the paperwork settled down, I finally had enough silence to recognize something uncomfortable about my entire adult life. I was never loved for being myself. I was loved for being useful. There's a difference. And a lot of people don't realize they're trapped inside that difference until something finally breaks hard enough to expose it. In my family, Preston was the emotional emergency. I was the cleanup crew. If Preston overspent, people rushed to protect him because he was under pressure. If he made bad business decisions, everyone talked about how talented he was and how unfair life had become. Meanwhile, I got rewarded for absorbing problems quietly. Military deployment? Audrey can handle it. Financial stress? Audrey's responsible. Emotional disappointment? Audrey's strong. Do you know how dangerous it is when a family starts praising one child primarily for their ability to tolerate pain? Because eventually everybody stops seeing that person as human. They start seeing them as infrastructure, like electricity, like plumbing. Something that simply continues functioning no matter how much pressure gets dumped into the system. That realization hit me harder than the fraud did. Not the forged documents, not the stolen land. The fact that my own mother genuinely believed I would eventually surrender the property just to keep everybody else comfortable. And honestly, for a long time, she probably would have been right. That's the part people rarely admit out loud. A lot of responsible adults are actually just exhausted children who learned early that love becomes unstable the second they stop fixing things for everybody else. I learned that lesson young. When my parents fought, I became quiet so nobody had to worry about me too. When money got tight, I stopped asking for things. When Preston screwed up, I became understanding. Families love calling one child mature when what they really mean is, we discovered which kid will abandon their own needs first. That pattern follows people into adulthood in ways they don't even notice. You overextend at work. You tolerate disrespect in relationships. You become the friend everybody calls during emergencies, but mysteriously disappears when your life falls apart. And eventually, you wake up one day realizing people don't admire your selflessness nearly as much as they depend on your lack of boundaries. That was probably the biggest lesson this entire disaster taught me. Not legal strategy, not property law, boundaries, real boundaries, not fake social media boundaries where people post inspirational quotes between emotional meltdowns and online shopping sprees. Actual boundaries, the kind that cost relationships, the kind that disappoint manipulative people, the kind that force others to finally experience consequences without using your life as a financial airbag. Because here's something I wish more people understood. Healthy love respects limits. Toxic love punishes them. The second I stopped cooperating with my family's dysfunction, I became cold, selfish, dramatic, and disloyal. Interesting how quickly people redefine your character once they lose access to your sacrifice. And I know some viewers listening right now probably recognize that feeling immediately. Maybe not through stolen property, maybe through money, or caregiving, or addiction, or constantly being expected to rescue relatives who keep making the same destructive choices over and over while calling it family. At some point, you have to ask yourself a brutal question. If your only value to certain people comes from what they can extract from you, is that actually love? That question changed my life permanently. And I want to say something practical too, because emotional stories are meaningless if nobody learns anything useful from them. If you inherit property, understand the paperwork yourself, not emotionally, legally. Read the title structures, understand easements, know who controls access rights, utilities, beneficiaries, tax obligations, and transfer authority. Keep original records somewhere secure. And please, stop assuming family members would never do that. Most financial betrayal doesn't begin with evil masterminds. It begins with rationalization. We're just borrowing temporarily. We'll fix it later. They'll understand eventually. That's how people slowly walk themselves into behavior they once swore they'd never justify. Also pay attention to something else. When people become angry simply because you ask financial questions, that reaction itself is information. Healthy people explain things clearly. Manipulative people pressure you emotionally for asking at all. My mother didn't explode because I accused her unfairly. She exploded because I interrupted a system that depended on me staying compliant. And honestly, I still struggled with guilt afterward. That surprised me, even after everything. Because when you spend your entire life being conditioned to protect everybody else emotionally, defending yourself can feel strangely immoral at first. Like you're betraying the group by refusing to keep bleeding quietly. But protecting yourself is not betrayal. Letting people destroy your future to maintain their comfort is not kindness, and carrying everybody else forever is not maturity. It's slow emotional bankruptcy. The hardest part of becoming an adult sometimes isn't building a career or buying a house or surviving hard things. Sometimes the hardest part is accepting that certain people only feel safe around the version of you that never says no. And once you finally understand that, you stop confusing guilt with responsibility. That's when your life actually begins changing. Not loudly, quietly. Like a lock finally turning after years of pressure against the wrong door. The strange part came afterward. Not the lawsuits. Not the frozen accounts. Not even the family fallout. The strange part was the silence. For the first couple weeks after everything collapsed, I kept waking up around 5:12 every morning with my heart already racing like I forgot to solve some emergency before going to sleep. That's what happens when your nervous system spends years operating like unpaid customer service for everybody else's bad decisions. You become addicted to anticipation, to tension, to fixing things before they explode. And when the chaos finally stops, your body almost doesn't know how to function without it. I'd wake up in the cabin before sunrise expecting texts, demands, emotional ambushes, or financial disasters. Instead, I'd hear wind moving through pine trees. That was it. No crisis, no guilt, no negotiations, just quiet. At first, the quiet honestly made me uncomfortable. That sounds ridiculous unless you grew up inside dysfunction yourself. People from healthy families think peace feels peaceful immediately. It doesn't always. Sometimes peace feels suspicious at first because your brain got trained to associate calm with the small pause before the next emotional explosion. I remember one morning about a month after the injunction hearing. I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee while rain tapped softly against the metal roof, and I realized something weird. Nobody needed anything from me. No emergency calls. No emotional cleanup. No requests disguised as family loyalty. My phone battery stayed at 87% all day because nobody was draining my life through it. That's when I understood how exhausted I actually was. Not physically. Relationally. There's a kind of tiredness people carry when they spend years monitoring everybody else's emotional weather patterns. You start predicting moods before conversations even happen. You rehearse explanations constantly. You soften your own opinions to prevent conflict. You become emotionally bilingual in manipulation without realizing it. And eventually, your entire personality starts as itself around keeping unstable people comfortable. That's not love. That's survival strategy. The silence helped me see that clearly. Little things started changing first. I stopped checking my phone every 4 minutes. I stopped apologizing automatically for things that weren't my fault. I stopped feeling guilty for resting. That last one hit harder than I expected. Because people raised inside emotionally demanding families often feel lazy the second they stop carrying everybody else. I'd sit at the cabin reading for an hour and suddenly this irrational panic that I was forgetting to solve somebody's problem somewhere. Turns out I wasn't forgetting anything. I just wasn't volunteering anymore. Huge difference. And honestly, some of the healing came from embarrassingly ordinary moments. Replacing the porch light without somebody criticizing how I installed it. Cooking dinner without tension sitting at the table. Falling asleep without replaying conversations, trying to figure out whether somebody secretly resented me. Peace is usually quieter than people imagine. It doesn't arrive with inspirational music and dramatic speeches. Sometimes it's just your nervous system finally realizing nobody's about to emotionally invoice you for existing. I also need to say something important here, because I think people oversimplify stories like mine online. Winning legally did not magically erase grief. I still mourned my family. Not the actual version, maybe, but the version I kept hoping existed underneath all the manipulation. That's the hard part nobody prepares you for. Sometimes healing means grieving people who are still alive. And that grief gets complicated because you're mourning potential more than reality. You mourn the mother you wanted, the sibling relationship that could have existed, the future holidays you thought your family might eventually deserve. That pain doesn't disappear just because you were technically right. There were nights at the cabin where I genuinely questioned myself. Not legally. Emotionally, I'd think maybe I should have compromised. Maybe I escalated too far. Maybe protecting myself cost too much. Then I'd remember something simple. My family was fully prepared to leave me homeless financially while I was deployed overseas, if it meant preserving their image and avoiding accountability. That wasn't conflict. That was betrayal. People need to stop minimizing betrayal simply because the people committing it share DNA with them. Family titles do not magically convert abuse into morality. I wish more adults understood that, especially the ones listening right now who still feel trapped carrying relationships entirely by themselves. If maintaining a connection requires you to constantly sacrifice your peace, your finances, your boundaries, your self-respect, or your mental stability while the other person sacrifices nothing, that relationship is already broken. You're just financing its appearance. That realization changed how I looked at boundaries, too. Before all this happened, I thought boundaries were emotional walls people used when relationships failed. Now, I think boundaries are maintenance systems. They keep relationships healthy the same way guardrails keep roads functional. Without them, eventually somebody drives off a cliff and acts shocked gravity existed. My biggest mistake wasn't trusting my family. It was ignoring smaller warning signs for years because confronting them felt uncomfortable. People tell themselves dangerous stories when they want peace badly enough. She didn't mean it like that. He's under stress. It's probably nothing. Meanwhile, your instincts keep quietly filing reports your emotions refuse to read. I ignored too many of those reports. Not anymore. These days, the cabin feels different. Not because the property changed, because I did. The silence taught me something I probably should learned years ago. A peaceful life is not built by endlessly fixing difficult people. It's built by refusing to hand unstable people permanent access to your nervous system. And once you finally experience that kind of peace, even briefly, you stop confusing emotional exhaustion with love forever. A few months ago, if someone asked me what strength looked like, I probably would describe endurance, military discipline, long deployments, staying calm under pressure, handling difficult situations without falling apart. And to be fair, those things matter. But after everything that happened with my family, I see strength differently now. Real strength is recognizing when people are slowly training you to disappear inside your own life. That's what manipulation often looks like in adulthood. Not dramatic screaming, not movie villains, just gradual access, little compromises, small guilt trips, constant expectations that somehow only flow in one direction. And because it happens slowly, people normalize it, especially inside families. One person becomes the caretaker, one becomes the problem everyone protects. And eventually, the entire emotional economy of the family starts functioning around imbalance, while everybody pretends it's love. That's why I keep coming back to the word perimeter, because every healthy life needs one. Not walls, not isolation. A perimeter. Something clear enough to protect your peace before somebody else decides your kindness is community property. I didn't understand that for years. I thought being a good daughter meant flexibility, patience, sacrifice, keeping relationships together no matter how uneven they became. But there's a point where flexibility turns into permission, and once people realize you'll keep tolerating disrespect to avoid conflict, they stop adjusting their behavior entirely. Why would they? The system already benefits them. That's the danger of becoming the reliable one. Reliable people often become emotional hostages without noticing. Everyone trusts them to absorb pressure. Everyone assumes they'll forgive eventually. Everyone quietly builds their own comfort on top of that person's ability to endure discomfort. Until one day the reliable person finally says, "No more." And suddenly everybody acts shocked. Not because the behavior was acceptable, because accountability interrupted convenience. That's what happened in my family. My mother and brother did not view themselves as villains. That part is important. Most destructive people don't. They viewed themselves as desperate people making difficult choices under pressure. But pressure does not create character. Pressure reveals it. And when protecting appearances became more important than protecting me, they showed exactly where I ranked in the family structure. Useful, replaceable, expected to comply. I know some people listening to this story are probably wrestling with their own version of that realization right now. Maybe it's not stolen property. Maybe it's a parent who constantly borrows money and calls you selfish when you hesitate. Maybe it's a sibling who only contacts you during emergencies. Maybe it's a relationship where your boundaries keep getting treated like emotional attacks. Or maybe it's simply the exhaustion of always being the emotionally responsible person in every room you enter. If that's you, I want to tell you something I wish somebody told me years ago. Being needed is not the same thing as being respected. A lot of people confuse those two ideas because dysfunctional relationships train them to. People praise your loyalty while benefiting from your exhaustion. People call you strong while handing you burdens they should be carrying themselves. People celebrate your patience because your patience protects them from consequences. That's not always love. Sometimes it's dependency wearing sentimental language. And honestly, one of the most important things adults can learn is basic financial self-protection. Not because money matters more than relationships, because money reveals relationships faster than almost anything else. Learn how property ownership works. Read documents before signing them. Understand inheritance structures before family emergencies happen. Keep copies of important records somewhere secure. Know who has legal authority over what. And please stop assuming uncomfortable conversations are unnecessary, simply because people share your last name. Some of the worst financial disasters happen inside families, specifically because nobody wants to appear distrustful. Manipulative people count on that discomfort. They rely on your reluctance to ask direct questions. I'm grateful my grandfather understood that. He loved me enough to leave me more than property. He left me structure, protection, distance between ownership and manipulation. At the time, I thought he was just being practical. Now, I think he understood the family better than I wanted to admit. And here's the truth nobody really talks about enough. Revenge itself did not heal me. Winning the legal battle didn't magically fix everything. What healed me was finally stopping the lifelong habit of abandoning myself whenever other people demanded access to pieces of me they didn't earn. That changed everything. Because once you stop volunteering to destroy your own peace for dysfunctional people, your entire life starts reorganizing itself differently. You sleep differently, think differently, choose differently. Even silence feels different. You stop chasing approval from people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop negotiating your worth during every conflict. And eventually you realize protecting yourself is not cruelty. It's maintenance. These days, when I stand on the porch of that cabin and look out across those 15 acres, I don't think much about revenge anymore. I think about direction, about instincts, about the quiet voice people ignore for years because disappointing others feels scarier than disappointing themselves. That voice matters. Listen to it sooner. And remember something my family accidentally taught me better than anyone else ever could. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop volunteering to be the bridge people keep burning behind you. If this story meant something to you, and you enjoy grounded family revenge stories with real emotional lessons, realistic legal twists, and honest conversations about boundaries, dignity, and self-respect, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are a lot more stories waiting beyond the perimeter.